I decided to give this honey oak double-level kitchen island a makeover. Now I will have to move these outlets down a bit so I can cut off this back part to make the island all the same height. So let's get into it. First off, we removed the kitchen countertops and sink. The sink and countertop were fused together, so we had to replace the sink for this makeover as well. While the countertops were off, we took note of where all of the wiring was and made marks, because we'll definitely need to know that for later. We used a cordless circular saw with a laser level to guide us to make the cut. Then we had to install the countertops. To make the angles we needed for this island, we laid the butcher block piece where we wanted it and marked the corners underneath on both sides. Then flip over the butcher block and draw a straight line from one corner that you marked to the next. This will be the line that you need to cut on. We made the cuts using a 60 teeth fine finish saw blade. After all of the cuts were made, we dry fit the pieces to ensure they are good. And here's what we have so far. Since we had to move the outlets down and we were left with a little hole here, I just nailed in a scrap piece of wood and then used Bondo to fill in the rest of the gap. Next, it's time to seal the butcher block on the top, bottom, and all sides. I used a water-based polyurethane and gave it 2 coats. Once the poly was all dry, I lay the pieces upside down so that I can router out the space needed for the miter bolts to sit. Be sure to measure for any obstacles that you'll need to avoid where your seams are. Obviously, I can't put a miter bolt where this brace is because then I won't be able to get underneath there to tighten the bolt upon install. So I'll use that measurement here to avoid that area and then space out the rest of the miter bolts evenly. I'll trace each bolt, then I'm going to use a plunge router to carve out the space needed for them to all sit. You're going to go about a 1/2 inch deep into the wood. After you're done carving out the miter spaces, apply some sealer to these fresh cuts. Now when it comes to attaching the countertops, one of the seams was blocked by framing, so I would not be able to tighten the bolts from underneath. For that seam, I had to attach it on the floor and tighten it good, then place both pieces together on top of the island. The second seam I was able to access from underneath to get the bolts nice and tight, so I put that together on top of the island. For the seams, you will apply some wood glue to each side, then bolt them together using a crescent wrench to tighten. For a complete tutorial on how to cut, finish, and install butcher block countertops, see the tutorial linked below in the description. After the countertops were installed, it was time to put in the new sink. I used a 2x4 scrap to hold the sink up tight to the counter while I installed the brackets. I kept the brace there overnight while the silicone sealant set up. Now back to the seams. There was a slight gap, so I mixed up some wood glue with the sawdust from when we cut the boards and filled the gaps in with this mixture. Wipe off the excess with a paper towel, then take a plastic scraper and scrape off more excess from each side of the seam. Let this dry for an hour or so, then apply a second layer. After that dries, lightly sand it with 220 grit sandpaper. After that, clean off all the dust and then apply a few coats of food-safe polyurethane. Mix the poly with some paint thinner so it settles in good to the surface. This helps to avoid brush or roller marks from the poly being too thick. Okay, now it's time to actually reface the island. I kept these end caps as is, so I had to sand down where I put the Bondo and give the entire surface a light sanding using 150 grit sandpaper. Since this has a wood grain, I applied Aqua Coat. The Aqua Coat fills in the wood grain for you and gives you a smooth finish. You just apply it using a plastic scraper, then you scrape off the excess. You let it dry for an hour or so, then sand it with 150 grit sandpaper. I had to do 2 coats to completely fill in the wood grain. I did the same thing to the front of the island since I would not be refacing this section either. After I was done with the Aqua Coat, clean off all of the dust completely, then apply 2 coats of primer. Now for refacing the rest of the island, I used 2-inch wide MDF trim molding for the sides and top, and 3-inch wide for the bottom. I cut to fit and mitered all the corners and attached it with a brad nailer. Remember, earlier I took note and marked where the wiring was on the inside of this island so I can avoid nailing into it now. My son came out to help me with this part. After all of the trim was installed, I cut and nailed on the shiplap. I used a laser level throughout the project to keep everything level during the install. It was nice having a helper here because he could nail all the pieces on while I was out cutting them, and we can get everything done in half the time. Once all the shiplap was up, I used some paintable trim and molding caulk to fill in all of the seams and used wood filler to fill in all the nail holes. Since I installed new counters and flooring, I had to also add an extra base shoe mold at the bottom and an extra trim piece at the top. For painting, I used this bare cabinet and trim enamel on my half-bath vanity 8 months ago, and it's held up perfect, so I gave it a go on this island as well. Since the color I chose was dark, I had to paint 3 coats to get complete coverage. There's a link below in the description to the blog post, and that has a complete list of materials, along with links on where you can find them. And here's the finished project. Since this kitchen and living room were all the same, bringing this island down to the same height really opened up this space. I'm so happy with the results, I absolutely love it. If you found this helpful, be sure to subscribe for more DIY Made Easy.